Hello, I'm Ann Bocock, and welcome to Between the Covers. George M. Tabor spent 40 years as a reporter and editor, 21 of those years at Time magazine. He worked in both the United States and in Europe. He also, after that, started his own weekly business newspaper. And then he found another passion, and that was being an author. He was very successful in books that he wrote about wine. Well, today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about wine, a lot more time talking about gold. His latest book is Chasing Gold, the incredible story of how the Nazis stole Europe's bullion. It is my pleasure to welcome George M. Tabor.
Thank you.
Just bear with me for a second before we get to this book, which is pretty incredible. When you were writing about wine, you had a very successful run with these books. What was it that you thought, this is the book I need to write?
I've been thinking about this book for literally, I hate to say it, a half century.
Really?
48 years. 48 years ago, I was a young Time magazine reporter in Brussels, Belgium, and I got a call from my boss in Paris one day, and he said, you know, I picked up this story in Paris that during World War II, the Belgians turned their gold over to the French, and then the French turned it over to the Nazis. He said, that'd be a great story, make the French look really bad. And he said, check it out. I checked it out, and the story was true. That is exactly what happened. And that started my interest in this topic, and I've been reading about it and studying it for long. I mean, I worked hard. I really concentrated on it for about 5 years. But during that whole period, it was always in the back of my mind that this was the real book I wanted to write, because this was the one that has obsessed me.
I'm going to take a step back for a minute. You said making the French look really bad. Well, when you wrote your book, Judgment at Paris, which was about French wine and American wine. Actually, give me a little history on that, because the French didn't turn out too well in that either.
That's true now that I think of it. I guess all my books are anti-French, you could say. No, there was a wine tasting in Paris in 1976, part of the bicentennial. And there was an Englishman who had a wine shop in Paris, and he thought, gee, it'd be interesting to have a tasting of the very best French wines against these totally unknown California wines that they were starting to hear about. So he got together the very best French judges, he got the very best French wines, and it was a blind tasting. And in the strangest of all things about the story, there was only one journalist who showed up that day, because all the other journalists, besides me, knew that obviously the French were going to win, so nobody's going to write a story, publish a story about a wine tasting in which the French wines beat California wines. But what happened was that in both the white category and the red category, the California wines won. It got into Time magazine, and it transformed not just California wines, it put them on the map, but really changed the whole world of wine, because before that, the attitude was only in France could you make great wines. That day, it was shown that you could make great wines elsewhere.
You were with Time magazine at that time. You were stationed.
At that point, I was in Paris.
You were in Paris. What made you decide to even cover this story?
I knew the owner. I turned down the invitation the first time.
You did?
Yes. And then he called me about a week before, and he said, basically, nobody's coming. No press is coming. This is supposed to be a press event. Nobody's coming. He said, couldn't you please come? And then I said, well, if I don't have anything more important to do, I'll see if I could get there. And I grew up in Southern California, Riverside, California, just outside Los Angeles. And I think I've thought a lot about that question that you just asked of why was I there. I think there was a little bit of pride of California. I knew the California wines are going to be there, and so I thought, well, and it was it was a slow day, not a cold day. It was a slow day at the paper, and so I decided to go down and then I watched it, and it was very interesting. I mean, the French judges got totally confused. They couldn't tell which was a French wine, which was a California wine. There's one dramatic moment where a guy holds up a wine and he says, back to France, and he tastes it. I looked down. I was the only one in the room who had a scorecard. They didn't have a scorecard. I looked at my scorecard, and he just tasted a California wine.
How fortuitous that you went. It turned into a best-selling book.
That was sold very well, and it's been made into one movie, and actually a second movie is going to be made about it.
And now you feel that you are you a connoisseur of wine now?
Let's say I drink a lot.
Okay. On to other questions about this book. The subtitle is The Incredible Story of How the Nazis Stole Europe's Bullion. Incredible is not the wrong word, let's put it that way. This is an incredible story.
Well, this was the world's biggest robbery. The Nazis stole 600 tons of gold from Europe's central banks. At that point, that gold was worth $600 million. Today, that gold would be worth $22 billion. So this was a big thing, but it was very important for the Nazis to have an independent source of gold, to get the gold, so that they could buy some very crucial war weapons that they had to pay for in gold.
I'm full disclosure here. I was not versed in the economic history of World War II, pre-World War II. So when I read this for the first time, so much of it really shocked me. And what I liked about it is it's not anywhere like a textbook for anyone who has not read it. There are heroes, there are villains, got some very shady characters in here. It's more like a thrill ride.
I found it an exciting story. I mean, as I got into it more and more, the characters were fascinating. I mean, the leading German character, I mean, Hitler is obviously a leading character in it, but his finance minister and also head of the central bank was a strange guy but who had the name Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht. So why in the hell is the president of the bank of the Reichsbank, why is he called Horace Greeley? Well, it happens that his father had been an immigrant to the United States, turned out to be a failed immigrant, and he admired and loved Horace Greeley. Go West, young man, and so he decided to name his son Horace Greeley. Well, and the son, actually, the guy who was the mastermind behind all this, was conceived in the United States. He was born in Germany, but he was conceived in the United States at the 2 months after they got back there. And he was the one who came up with a plan that they wanted Germany to be totally independent so they wouldn't have to buy goods any place in the world. But there were a few military products like petroleum and stainless steel, and they had to get their high grades. Germany had lots of low-grade iron ore, but low-grade iron ore is not good enough for tanks and bomber airplanes. They had to have high-grade steel, but they needed to get a mineral that came out of Spain and Portugal, and for all of those kind of products, they had to pay in gold, because those countries wouldn't accept the Reichsmark in payment. They didn't have enough US dollars and they had British pounds, so gold is the product that anybody will always accept in payment. And so that's what they did, which was to go out and rob the central banks. And they also got a lot of individual gold especially from Jewish people.
It was an obsession. Getting their hands on the gold was an obsession. There was a word in the book that you use, I think it's a German word, is it autarky?
That means self-sufficiency.
Which explained a lot of it to me. After World War I, they found themselves in this predicament and they were not going to let that happen again.
Exactly. Because it really was the British blockade in World War I that really defeated the Germans. I mean, the Americans like to think it was the Yanks are coming and that's why the British won World War I, but it really was that blockade that starved the Germans. And the Germans said, never again. We've got to be self-sufficient. We have to have autarky. And that's why they had that policy, but they couldn't get those few very rare products. Those they had to pay for with gold.
You have a quote in the beginning of the book that I think you attributed to Gerald Loeb, who was the founding partner of E.F. Hutton, the brokerage firm. And it said, the desire for gold is the most universal and deeply rooted commercial instinct of the human race.
Has been for thousands and thousands of years and probably will be for long into the future. I mean, just what have we seen in the last few weeks? The price of gold in the world market it was down for a while, but it's gone up as some of the economic problems in Europe have gotten stronger. The price of gold has gone up. It's the one thing that the world, there's not much of it. It's very rare. People have used it for centuries, for jewelry, but also as a safe haven. Again, paper money isn't always the safest thing there. Gold you can always save. So especially in wartime, people are trying to escape from a country. What do they take? They take diamonds and gold because both of them have high values, and also they can be carried if you have to leave in the middle of the night.
Exactly. Women have sewn gold into the hems of their skirts. What was interesting is that when you read the book, you're taken back to another time, because for instance, today you want to pay for something, it's a credit card, it's on your phone, it is so far from the realm of actual currency, right. Actual gold money. They had to physically move this heavy gold from one country, out of that country, to where they thought were safer places. And they did that a lot of times by ship.
A lot of it went by ship. Once it became known that the Germans were trying to steal all this gold, the countries, the central banks in particular, they wanted to get it out of Europe. First they shipped it to Britain. This is when they thought Britain was safe. Then after the attacks on Britain, it was clear that Britain was not safe, so they wanted to get it across the ocean. They wanted to have an ocean between the Germans and where the gold was. And so the gold was shipped to the United States. First it landed in New York, and a lot was shipped to Canada.
Who sent gold here?
All the major countries. I mean, the British sent a lot, the French sent a lot, the Belgians sent, everybody that had gold. Because Fort Knox, it first went to the Federal Reserve, which is in Lower Manhattan. They have a very, very strong protection area there under the main building of the Federal Reserve. But after a while, there was so much there. In fact, one of the dramatic moments of the book, for me at least, was on the 5th of May, 1940. Europe is really, it was the 10th of May was when the Germans invaded the Low Countries, Spain, France, Holland, and Belgium. So this was just before that. And the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, happened to be in Chicago. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, he woke up and he scribbled himself a note. And I found a copy of that actually at the Roosevelt Library in Heights Park, New York. And on the note, he said, tomorrow morning, call his secretary and tell them to ship all the gold to Kentucky. He didn't say Fort Knox because Kentucky had been open there before, but they thought of Kentucky, not Fort Knox. And he woke up the next morning, his son had been with him in the room, and his son said to him, Dad, what was that note you wrote in the middle of the night? And he said, I don't know, what did I write down? He had forgotten that he'd written it. But the message had gotten through. Then they sent all the gold down to Fort Knox.
Henry Morgenthau, that you just mentioned, was also interesting in this book. Yes, I knew of him, but I didn't know how integral a part he played.
Well, he and Roosevelt were
They were
very
childhood
close.
friends, weren't
They
they?
were childhood friends. They both had homes up in the Finger Lakes, not the Finger Lakes, upstate New York on the Hudson, and they were just very close. They were brothers. I say in the book that Henry Morgenthau was the brother that Franklin Roosevelt never had.
Also the Jewish brother.
Exactly.
Okay.
That was.
Now, we talked about the gold being moved by ships, also by rail. There was one in the book that was very interesting where the ship was actually sunk on purpose. I believe it was a British ship. They had been under attack, and I believe the commander at that time said, we can't let the Germans get the gold, so they let the ship sink.
Yeah, but I mean, there were some cases like that, but it really was a unique case. I mean, for the most part, and what is really shocking was how much gold got through to get to the United States. I mean, the British sent 200 tons of gold, and at that point, it was, this was the worst time of the U-boat attacks in the North Atlantic. I mean, ships were going down day after day, and it was impossible I mean, it seemingly was impossible. But they lost very, very few ships.
And I'm sure that the crew knew what was on board.
Yeah, yeah.
How did you put this book together? Because there is, when you read it, it is done country by country in a very concise, easy to understand way. But most of the information that you looked at certainly wasn't written in English.
No, it was a it was a linguistic nightmare
I bet
to
it
do the
was.
book. I mean, I can speak and read French and German, a little bit of English too, but
That helps.
but all of these other languages. Sometimes I would get a document. For example, the guy who conducted the Norwegian rescue operation, which was very complex. And first, the Norwegians, they went all the way up if you look at a map, how long Norway is, they took it all the way up. Then they took it to Britain, and then they were worried about losing it in Britain, so they took it across the Atlantic. When he had finally finished his trip, he sat down and wrote a 70-page report for the central bank. And I was in the research, I was talking with somebody at the bank of the National Bank of Norway, and he told me, he said, well, we've got the 70-page report, but it's in Norwegian. Okay, I found somebody, thanks to the internet, I found somebody who translated the 70-page report for me. And it was a wonderful document to have the guy who ran the whole program sitting there, immediately after it's over, going through step by step what he did and what they did.
I can only imagine what your desk looked like with papers piled up to the ceiling, because it was so much information.
My wife was ready to throw me out.
I'm sure. I'm hoping your next book, she's hoping your next book doesn't have all these maps and documents in it. But how long did it take, honestly, to put it together?
Well, between writing and researching, it was about 5 years.
It's a long time.
Yeah, it was a good 3 years of writing. I mean, a lot of times, you're writing, sometimes you're writing and researching at the same time. And I told the stories the way I did. I told them chronologically because that's the way it happened, So we start with the Austrian story, because Austria was the first country that the Nazis invaded, and they got 90 tons of gold there, plus 14 tons from the Jewish community in Vienna. And so that was really important. Then we went on to Czechoslovakia, Poland, Norway, all of the very country by country, just as they were being invaded. And each country had a different story. I mean, the Norwegian story is different from the Polish story.
And you had ships traveling to Africa.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in some ways, the wildest story in the whole book is what happened to the Belgian gold. The Belgian gold was first sent to France. Then it was sent down to Casablanca. Don't want to make this into a geographic test, geology or geographic test. But then it went down to Dakar, which is, sticks out into the hump of Africa. Then the French were so worried that if the Germans were still going to get it, they took it inland. And then this is where the French gave the Belgian gold to the Nazis. The French gave this Belgian gold. They had taken all the way to the middle of the Sahara. They took it across the desert to Algiers, and it was taken by plane to Marseille, and then from Marseille was taken by train to Berlin. That was the most gold that the Nazis got, was that Belgian gold.
That is incredible,
Yeah.
as the subtitle says, incredible. How much is missing?
A lot was missing. A lot fell into other people's hands. Several hundred tons were never found.
We probably don't have time to get into the whole story, but there's an interesting part about the Vatican as well, which I have heard, and I think maybe we've heard parts of this before. Secrecy, gold, the Vatican.
Well,
Yeah.
it was in June of late June of 1940. The Nazis by that time had pretty well run over France. They had certainly run over Holland and Belgium. And the United States at that point did not have an ambassador. It was considered church and state. It was a little too cozy, but Roosevelt had sent somebody to be at the Vatican that he was called the special representative of the president. And one day they got a call from a cardinal, and they said, "Want to tell you, we've got in effect, 7 tons of gold here that we would like to ship to the United States. We want to get it out of Europe. And so the representative of Roosevelt sent it back to the Federal Reserve and also the Treasury Department, and the poor Americans, they were just flummoxed because they had never dealt with a religious order like that. They're used to dealing with central banks, and they didn't know if they had the power or the right to deal with a central bank. So they had this run around for a long time trying to figure out if it was going to. So then finally they were having secret talks and say none of this should be put into writing. I found one document that said none of this should be in writing. Okay. Fortunately, I found it.
I like that written down. None of this should be in writing. Okay.
But anyway, so they decided to take it, and the 7 tons were taken first and shipped to England, and then they were shipped across to New York.
Fantastic.
And they stayed in the Vatican at the Federal Reserve until the end of the war, and then they were shipped back.
Earlier, when you mentioned the wonderful character with the name Horace Greeley-Schott, he really thought he could control Hitler.
Yeah.
That was one arrogant man as well.
Arrogance does not quite describe him. He was a very self-confident person, shall we say. I mean, he had a great track record. He was, a lot of people don't know it or remember it, but one of history's great inflations, in fact, some people even think it was the greatest inflation of all history, was the 1920s in Germany, when at one point you could buy, $1 was worth something like 10 quadrillion Reichsmarks. I mean, the currency was, those were the days where literally people would have wheelbarrows full of money to buy a loaf of bread. And he was the banker that stopped that. So as a result of that, he had great prestige. And when he threw in his great prestige with the Nazis, it was very important because he gave Hitler the prestige, and then, and at that, Hitler and he later had a falling out, but he thought he could control Hitler. Terrible mistake.
As far as gold and as a commodity on a monetary basis, you would now be my go-to person. I think you probably know more about gold than anyone else. Do you think anything could ever take the place of gold?
Not really, because of the nature of what gold is. I mean, gold is rare and in great demand. All the gold in the world could fill up 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools. All the gold ever discovered in history, 3 swimming pools. So it's a rare commodity. But at the same time, for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, people have desired it. They love to have, for whatever reason, for jewelry, and it's throughout history. I mean, as far as and as old as there is history, gold always had a value. It doesn't, you can't burn it. It doesn't, it doesn't corrode. It's priceless, and it's the only product in the world like that, and I think always will be. And now it's not used for international currency transactions like it used to be, but the gold price is way up there. I mean, gold during the period of the whole period of the book was at $35 an ounce. And for all the gold bugs out there, I'm sure you know that current price for gold is between $1,200 and $1,300 an ounce. So I mean, it's still very, very valuable.
Well, we've covered.
And I think always will be.
We've covered wine. We've covered gold. What's next? I know you're working on something.
Well, I'm kicking around several ideas. I'm not trying to dodge, but I haven't really decided on which one to talk about. The one topic that we didn't get into, and if you wouldn't mind, let me talking about this a little bit, because in a lot of ways it wasn't a huge amount of gold, but it was in a lot of ways the most disgusting part of the book for me to write, and that was the book. The chapter is called Melmer Gold. In 1942, Himmler went to the head of the Reichsbank and said, we're getting a lot of gold out of the concentration camps. People are taking gold into the concentration camps because they didn't know they were going to be killed in the concentration camp. They were told they were just going to be moved. And some people, and a lot of people had jewelry, and so they were getting the gold and they didn't know what to do with it. And they said, basically, we don't have the facilities at the SS. Can you handle the gold? So the guy that the colonel that was given the order to bring that gold in was named Melmor, and at the Reichsbank they used to call it Melmor Gold. And for the next 2.5 years, up to February of 1945, gold would be taken from the concentration camps and taken.
And you will read that. That needs to be read, that chapter. George M. Tabor, thank you so much for joining me today. The book, Chasing Gold. What a pleasure to have you.
Thanks very much. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. I'm Ann Bocock. You have been watching Between the Covers. Until next time, thank you.